Hello, welcome back here to English 111 at Delta College. This is week 7, which is the final week of instruction. We're getting down to the home stretch now. So, this week we're going to talk about the final assignment, which is the literary analysis. So, let's go ahead and get started. So, when we get into literary analysis, we're talking about literary criticism. And criticism, I may have mentioned before, in fact, I probably did mention before, but criticism is a term which is often misused or misunderstood. Criticism is usually taken to have a negative connotation, that you're finding fault in something. But that's not what it means. Criticism is the means by which we find the meaning in something. So, in the case of a text, and I'm using the term text loosely here, that could be a written text, it could be a visual text, it could be anything that has been composed. Could include music. So a text can be analyzed or criticized from several different sort of angles. And there are 9 basic sort of schools, if you will, of literary criticism. And I've posted a handout on e-learning to help you, but I'm just going to go through and briefly define each of these. Now, note that this week the assigned reading isn't in the form of written text, but rather video texts. So I've linked some videos on e-learning, and I've referenced them here. Those are going to be the assigned reading for this week. Okay, so historicism. Historicism is to approach the text from an historical perspective. So, trying to sort of recreate or understand the historical context behind the production of the text. What does the text reveal about the historical period in which it was produced? Or what does it reveal about the person who produced that text and that person's life? Now, if there are 3 parts to a literary or a textual equation, you have, let's say, the creator or the author, you have the reader or the audience, and then you have the text itself. Each of these critical approaches focus on different parts of that equation. So historicism focuses primarily on the author part of the equation, trying to reconstruct or understand what it was that the author was responding to within the historical or social context. So, what does the text reveal about the author's life or about the historical period in which it was created? Formalism, this is the approach that most people are familiar with because it was taught for many, many years in public schools. And, many of your public school teachers have been trained in formalism, though perhaps they don't realize it, and they've passed it on to their students. So formalism is where you do a close reading of the text. It specifically focuses on form and how the text corresponds or conforms to that form. So, for example, if it is a short story, how does it employ the formal elements of narrative in order to tell the story? If it's poetry, how does it use the formal elements of poetry in order to create the poem or convey the meaning? So formalism focuses on the textual part of the equation. A formalist will say you cannot understand the social context for the work because the author could not tell you what he or she was thinking when they produced that work. They don't know themselves. So you can't look at the historical context. You can't look at the reader part of the equation because the reader is going to read everything in a different way and interpret things differently according to their own experiences. So the only stable part of the equation is the text itself. So formalism looks only at the text and tries to decode the text. The idea is that there is a hidden meaning in the text that must be decoded. And you decode the text by looking for symbols or certain word usage or uh, certain patterns that emerge from the text. You analyze those. You try to explain what the text really means using those symbols or images or patterns as evidence. Psychoanalytic criticism, uh, fairly self-explanatory, comes from the theories of Sigmund Freud, the idea that everything that we do is based upon our unconscious motivations. So the psychoanalytic criticism approaches the text from three different ways. Primarily, it approaches the text from the author's part of the equation, trying to interpret what the author what the author's unconscious motives or desires were in creating that text. So what does it reveal about the author's psyche? You can also apply this to the reader part of the equation and try to explain or identify why you, as a reader, read the text the way that you do. What does it reveal about you and your subconscious? So, for example, back in the 1980s, there was this sort of trend in looking at movies or music, rock music in particular, as being sort of satanic or demonic in origin. And so people would play music backwards in order to find the secret messages in the text. And what they found always revealed more about themselves, because if they went looking for it, they were going to find it. Now, that doesn't mean the text itself had that meaning there. It's because that meaning was put into it by whoever was looking for it. So you can apply psychoanalytic criticism, to the reader part of the equation by, what are you looking for and what does that reveal about you? You can also apply it to the text itself, although that's a little bit tricky. So you can look at a text protagonist, for example, and try to explain why the protagonist does what he or she does. What's motivating the protagonist's actions. The problem with that is that because you're dealing with interpreting unconscious motives and desires, a character in a text has no unconsciousness. It's not a real person. So all that you can interpret, or all that you could really get from it, is what the author would think would be that character's unconscious motives. But that's still valuable in gaining a greater understanding of the text as well. Archetypal criticism comes primarily from the theories of Carl Jung, who was one of Freud's students. So Jung was a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, and he was focused on dream interpretation. And what he found was that many of his patients would come to him and describe their dreams. And even though these patients were unrelated to each other and didn't know each other, they had very similar patterns in their dreams. And so that's caused Jung to come up with his theories of archetypes. An archetype is a universal symbol that gets represented in our subconscious works. So our works of art and our dreams, the sort of narratives or images that come through those all can be traced back to what he called the collective unconscious. Basically, the idea here is that there are some experiences that are so fundamental to humanity that they become sort of imprinted on our DNA or on our unconsciousness. And so we constantly relive these patterns, these experiences in our art, in our dreams. We're constantly playing them out. So the classic example of the archetype is the hero's journey, which basically represents the sort of rites of passage that we go through in our journey from childhood to adulthood. And the video that I've linked here goes into greater depth in explaining that. But the idea of an archetypal criticism is to identify what are the archetypes in the text and what do they mean. So, for example, if you're looking at Harry Potter or Star Wars, you'll notice that there are a lot of similarities between the two. And it's not necessarily deliberate. It's just that both of those creators, in this case, J.K. Rowling and George Lucas, were dealing with these archetypes, these universal symbols, and retelling uh, the same story, but telling it in a new or different way. So archetypal criticism goes through and identifies, okay, here are the common symbols that are mythological in origin or that we ascribe mythological meaning to. And here's how they're being used within this particular text. Reader response criticism. This focuses pretty obviously on the reader part of the equation and is sort of an outgrowth of psychoanalysis. Reader response criticism comes from the theories of Stanley Fish, who said that readers do not decode poems, they create them. What he basically meant is that the text itself is recreated every time it's read. So every reader reads something differently and will put their own meaning into it. So reader response criticism is about being self-conscious or self-aware of yourself as a reader. What does the text mean to you? Why is the text significant to you? How does it help you to understand your own life or your own experiences more? So it's applying the text to your own life. Marxism is also called socio-economic criticism, looks at the class structure within the text. What does the text reveal about class structure and class struggles, particularly between the working class or the proletariat, as Karl Marx called them, versus the bourgeoisie or the aristocracy or the ruling class? So what does the text reveal about class struggle? Does it support or reinforce or subvert one class and its values over another? And related to that is differential criticism. Differential criticism is a sort of a broad heading. It applies to looking at the text from the perspective of different social groups. So Afrocentric criticism looks at the text from the perspective of an African American. And what does the text reveal about race relations, particularly between Caucasians or minority versus majority social groups? Another form is feminist criticism, which is similar, except in that case, you're looking at what the text reveals about sex relationships between uh, men and women in terms of power dynamics. So, does the text support or subvert one group over another? And there are other ways of applying differential criticism, but the idea is to look at the text from the perspective of a certain social group. New historicism looks at the way that the meaning of the text has changed across time and the way that different people look at the text in different time periods. And what does that change reveal about ourselves? So if a text was received or perceived as one way in one time period, how do we perceive it differently? What change has occurred and what caused that change to come about? Just recently, I got into a discussion with a friend of mine about the movie Night of the Living Dead. And in Night of the Living Dead, the protagonist is a black man. And at the time, this is the 1960s, during the civil rights era, having a black protagonist in a movie, particularly a horror movie, was subversive. It wasn't done. And there's one part in that movie that's of particular importance. When I've shown clips of the movie in my classes, there's a part where the protagonist uh, gets into a situation with the lead female character. Again, the protagonist is black, whereas the lead female character is white, and the white woman begins to behave hysterically, and the protagonist slaps her. And when I've shown that in class, it's been kind of shocking because the idea that someone would slap a woman, it's the idea of the violence against women that's depicted in that scene, surprises people. However, that's slapping of a hysterical woman is a very common, what we would call trope or cliche in literature and in films from the 20th century. So at the time that that movie was made, no one would have paid attention to the fact that he slaps her. That's just, a common cliche. That's just what you do. It's kind of accepted within society. So people wouldn't have paid much attention to it back then the way they do now. Rather, what they would have paid attention to back then was the fact that it was a black man slapping a white woman. That would have been scandalous for the time. It would have been very sort of transgressive. Now, as we've progressed in our society in terms of race relations, the issue of a black man slapping a white woman isn't shocking. What's shocking is the fact that the woman was slapped. So that's how that we've seen that there has been a change in our society in the way that text has been interpreted or been received. But how do we account for that change? And what does that change reveal about our society? So that's new historicism. So looking at the text from across historical lines or across cultural lines. And then finally, deconstructionism is really kind of being playful with the text. It comes from the theories of linguistics, which looks at language and the way that language changes across cultural boundaries and the way that language gets formed. And in terms of deconstruction, the idea isn't what the text says, it's what the text does not say. Because there are certain things that, when it comes to language, we kind of take for granted, such as denotation and connotation. So what if you play around with multiple meanings of words? What if, for example, you have a story about a female dog? Now, the denotation for that would be the word bitch. Bitch means female dog. However, within our society, we hardly ever use the term bitch to mean female dog. We tend to use it in a multitude of different ways. So typically it's used to refer to an unpleasant woman, although it could also refer to an emasculated male. It depends on who's using the term and the context in which it's being used. So deconstruction will take a look at the term and sort of deliberately misuse it. So if the story has a woman, for example, who's called a bitch, a deconstructionist will say that, well, this is a story about a dog, a female dog. It's not about a woman. It's about a dog. How does changing that detail and that interpretation, that deliberate misreading of the text, how does it reveal what's actually being said in the text, or how does it provide a new interpretation to the text? So deconstructionism looks at the way that language gets used or misused within the text and deliberately misreads the text by reading it in an alternate way and trying to identify a deeper understanding or appreciation of the text from looking at it from an incorrect, and I'm putting incorrect in air quotation marks here, an incorrect perspective. Okay, so the reason why I've gone through each of these different critical approaches is because you need to be able to apply them, or at least mix and match or use one of these approaches in your essay, because you need to find a text. And again, text is a very broad term. It could be a written text, could be a visual text, could be a piece of art, it could be a work of music. Just choose a text and then analyze it using these different approaches. So you can focus on the text using only one approach if you want to, or you can mix and match them as you choose. So to sort of practice this or illustrate the idea that we're applying the criticism in different ways, I want to take a look at some visual text and read them critically. So I have a series of photographs here that I want to take a look at. This first one is from Dorothea Lange, Jobless on Edge of Pea Field, Imperial Valley, California, from 1937. Now, if we look at this from a formalist perspective, we can see that, well, it's a portrait. So it falls into the form or the category of portraiture. And if you're familiar with sort of the history of portraiture, typically the subject of a portrait is either a person of significance, of wealth and power, or it's of a family. But still, even if it's a family portrait, it's typically an upper class family that's represented in the portrait. So portraiture traditionally has been regarded as a sort of an upper class kind of art form. And this is subverting that form a little bit in the case here that the portrait is of a man who is not in a position of wealth or power. It is a poor man during the Great Depression. We know this is 1937. And the title is Jobless on Edge of Pea Field. So this is a jobless man during the Great Depression. And we can see that even though he's dressed in a way that is fairly formal by modern standards, we can tell that the clothing is somewhat shabby. So it's not the traditional person of wealth and power that would be depicted in a portrait, but rather the opposite of that. And so Lang is in some way subverting the expectations or the form of the portrait in order to create some meaning here. Now, in other ways, this conforms to the traditional form of the portrait. It is a person. It is very well balanced. You see that the person here is taking up the majority of the frame and is centered in the middle of the frame. And there are two other people sitting to either side of him to help create a sense of balance to the frame itself. There is a little bit more foreground than you would traditionally get in a portrait. But on the whole, this is a very sort of aesthetically pleasing example of a picture, in that it is, it's sort of visually interesting, but also not really disruptive. It's very well composed and well balanced, typical of portraiture. So in many ways, it follows the conventions of portraiture, while also the subject matter is being used to subvert those conventions of the form. So that would be a formalist reading of the text. Now, historicist, we can tell that this is in the Great Depression. So 1937, this photograph was taken. What do we know about that historical context? We know that many people were out of work because the economy was in it was in a depression. It was in a terrible state. And many people were jobless and poor and hungry. And so we have that represented in the text, and that this figure here, this gentleman, is clearly a poor person who is out of work. And why is he out of work? It's because of the state of the economy, that there is no work. I mean, there is work available, but no one to pay for the work. So that's the irony of the Depression, is that there were jobs. I mean, there was work that had to be done, but there was no money to to pay people to do the work. So that was the irony there, and we can kind of see that represented in this picture. This picture captures that particular historical context, and that's, here are these men on the edge of a pea field that is, what's the term I'm looking for? It's not in production, but it's growing. You can see in the background, you can see rows of the crops. So, the work needs to be done, but they're not able to do the work that is there. So there is the irony in that. So that would be an example of an historicist reading of the text. Walker Evans, Burroughs Family Cabin, Hale County, Alabama, 1936. So again, same time period, the Great Depression. In this case, the rural South. It's a family cabin in Alabama. The form of this would be the still life. And often, traditionally, the still life is a picture of either like a bowl of fruits or a plant or something like that. In this case, it's just a picture of a family cabin. Look at the way that it's composed. What draws your eye? How is this a sort of traditional representation of the still life form? But then how does it subvert that as well? You can see that this picture has a very clear bisection to it. There's the left side versus the right side. And that bisection is very literal in the sense that there is a panel of wood separating the two parts of the frame, along with what appears to be a towel there hanging from a nail, which helps to give you a visual delineation of the two sides. The foreground is on the right side. We see the wood paneling. It's a log cabin, and we have a shelf with a bowl and appears to be a wash basin on it. And then on the left side, we have the background, which appears to be a sort of dining room or kitchen, where you have a table with an oil lamp. Beyond that, there's a wooden chair, and beyond that is kitchen cabinetry with a large pitcher. So again, fairly well balanced, although there's almost what we would call a diptych aspect to this. A diptych is when you have a picture that's divided into two parts. So we have the two contrasting elements of the foreground and the background here. But still, well balanced. It draws the eye in different ways. So it's in many ways using those same conventions of the still life imagery. But instead of having everything in the foreground as a traditional still life image would, this breaks it up into two different planes. So it subverts the form in that way. Again, historicism. We can definitely see how this is a representation of the time period of the Great Depression. Not necessarily the fact that we're dealing with a family cabin of a poor family, although we would definitely associate what we see with poverty, but also just the historical period in terms of industry. This is not a prefabricated home like we're used to now. This is very clearly built by hand. Uh, we can say probably there's well craftsmanship that's gone into the building of this. I mean, someone knew what they were doing when they built this, and it's a very clean home and very presentable. So even though we associate it with poverty, there is a sense that this is within a certain time period, this would have been fairly standard. So this tells us something about what daily life was like for this place in the 1930s, that it's not industrialized, that there's no electricity. We can see that they're using an oil lamp for lighting instead of electrical lights. There's probably no running water. There's no sink here. We have a wash basin instead, where the water would be poured into it from a pitcher, and the water would have been drawn from a well by hand. A very sort of what we would consider to be a rustic lifestyle. So gives us a good sense of the time period. So again, applying formalism and historicism to the text, we can't really say anything about differential criticism because it doesn't really reveal anything about gender or race here, partly because we don't have people represented in the image. It may reveal something about class structure. So if you want to apply the Marxist approach, we can definitely say that this is a depiction of a lower class family or a lower class lodging. Certainly the upper classes, the more wealthy people, would not live in this particular way. They would be in much more luxurious surroundings. So does this support the values of the upper classes? Not necessarily. It doesn't show us a lifestyle to which we would want to aspire, uh, at least not necessarily. But it doesn't necessarily subvert them either, because it doesn't show how bad that lifestyle would be. This is just a simple lifestyle that we today probably would not to want to live in this way, but was a fairly common lifestyle back then. And then finally, Gordon Parks' American Gothic, 1942. Another example of portraiture, in this case, a sort of parody of Grant Wood's classic painting of American Gothic, which depicts a white man and woman uh, that we are meant to interpret as a married couple, an older married couple, in front of a middle class home. In this case, this is a portrait of a black woman who is in a position. We're meant to interpret a position of labor, apparently a cleaning person. We see that because of the mop and the broom represented here. We're meant to associate those with her profession or whatever it is that she does. And there is a contrast between that sort of uh, working class lifestyle with the American flag and what the American flag represents here. So, how are we to interpret that? Well, you can interpret it in different ways. You could see it as a representation of the American dream. That here is a woman who is a working woman, probably works hard for a living, and according to the American dream, if you work hard, then you will succeed. You will prosper. You could see it as a subversion of the American dream. In the case that, in the land of opportunity, here is a woman who apparently is an older woman. We can see that she has gray hair or gray inner hair. Um, we would probably expect a person of her age to be retired, and yet she is depicted as being someone who's still part of the labor force and a hard worker. So you could say there was an irony there, and that this person, even though she appears to be a hard worker, has not achieved the prosperity that the American dream says she should have. And then the fact that she is a black woman, you could read it from differential criticism and show the sort of expectations or the contrast between the reality of life for black people within the United States, especially at that point in time of 1942. And again, this is a parody or a what's the term I'm looking for? A sort of reconstruction of Grant Wood's classic painting of American Gothic, which sort of represents the sort of idealized American lifestyle, and how this probably isn't the ideal American lifestyle. Okay, so again, you can apply those critical approaches to any kind of text in order to interpret whatever it is the creator of the text is trying to say. Okay, so now that brings us to quoting and citing. Um, because whatever text you're dealing with, you're going to have to be able to, if it's a written text, you need to be able to quote from it. And then whatever the text is, you have to be able to cite it as well. So I want to remind you that quote is a verb and quotation is a noun. They mean two different things. So don't use them interchangeably. So don't write in your paper, as we see in this quote, the writer means whatever. No. Quote is a verb. Quotation is a noun. And why should we quote when we write? There are various uses for quotation, primarily as evidence. So if we want to prove whatever it is that we're saying about a piece of writing, then we have to be able to quote the writing to show that we're not just making it up. We have evidence to back up our interpretation. We can quote for analysis. So analysis is when you take something apart to see how it works and how it all fits together. So if you want to analyze the way a certain writer uses language, well, you can break it down into different passages or different examples of the language that the writer has used. So you can use quotation to analyze. You can use it for authority. So if you're writing something and you are trying to argue for a certain perspective, but you don't necessarily have expertise or are not recognized as being an authority figure in that subject field, you can sort of import that through the use of quotation. So, for example, if you want to argue about how important vaccines are, but you're not a doctor, then you can use the research that doctors have done or things that doctors have said about vaccines and use that to back up or to reinforce your position by appealing to their authority. So you can use quotations to support your argument by appealing to the expertise of recognized authorities. You can use quotation as a form of dialogue or conversation, and certainly that's how it gets used within narratives, right? We've seen that before when we looked at the narrative essay, that the way quotation is used as a form of dialogue or conversation between characters or people. And then finally, quotations can be used as epigraphs. Epigraphs are little quotations that typically appear at the beginning of a text before you get into the text itself. Sometimes it's at the front of a book. Sometimes it's at the top of the page of a chapter. It's a chapter heading, whatever it is. The idea is that the quotation is thematically relevant to whatever that book or that chapter is about. So the reader is meant to take what that epigraph says and then apply that theme to the text. Within academic writing, it is primarily the first three reasons for quotation that we use. So we typically use quotation as evidence to support or prove our positions, or to support through the use of authority, or to just simply analyze the way the language is used. So there's a difference between quotation and paraphrase. So a quotation is when you use someone's words exactly as they use them. So as I write here, as Lunsford states, use an author's exact words when those words are so memorable or express a point so well that you cannot improve or shorten it without weakening it. So in that case, I'm using her exact words as a quotation, and I'm putting it within quotation marks. A paraphrase is when you take the idea that the source uses, but you express it in a different way. You express it the way that you would word it. So as Lunsford states, quotations should only be used when the original text says something better than you can. In that case, I'm saying the same thing that Lunsford said, but I'm using my own words to say it. So that's an example of a paraphrase. Now, in English, and in the fields that we call the humanities, whenever we use an idea from an outside source, we have to give a citation. So whether we are quoting or paraphrasing, if we're using someone else's idea, then we have to cite that. But just so you know, the difference between quotation and paraphrase is quotation is using someone's exact words, and a paraphrase is rewording what they said and wording it or saying it the way that you would say it. So there are three basic parts to quoting. You have to introduce the quotation in some way, and you can do that through what we call an attribution phrase, such as according to Lunsford. But you have to set up the quotation in some way. You can't just drop the quotation into your paper and let it stand on its own. You have to do something with it. So you have to set it up or introduce it. You have to execute and cite. So execute is when you actually quote, and cite is when you give the attribution. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then we have to explicate. We have to explain why we're using that quotation, or explain what it means, or how it connects to what it is that we're trying to say. So in this case, I would introduce the quotation by saying, according to Lunsford, and then execute, use an author's exact words when those words are so memorable or express a point so well that you cannot improve or shorten it without weakening it. Cite, page 107, and then explicate, explain. What she means is that it is more important to focus on your own ideas and words and only quote when it is necessary. Okay, so block quotations. There are different citation formats. There's MLA, which we use in the humanities. MLA stands for Modern Language Association. There's APA, or American Psychological Association, which is used in the physical sciences, and CMS, or Chicago Manual of Style, which is used in the social sciences. And so they all have slightly different rules or regulations. This is an English class, so we're using MLA in here. And in MLA, when you quote, you always have to cite, but if your quotation runs longer than 4 lines, or rather runs 4 lines or longer, then you have to set that off as a block quotation. And to do that, you double indent from the left margin. You do not use quotation marks because that double indentation tells the reader that it is a quotation. So in this case, Lunsford states, and then I've indented the quotation twice, and I've given the quotation with the citation, but I'm not giving quotation marks. So that's called a block quotation. And in MLA, you use that block quotation form if your quotation is at least 4 lines or longer. If you have a shorter quotation that's fewer than 4 lines, then you would just, integrate it into your own writing using the quotation marks. Poetry, and I'm including music under poetry, is slightly different. When you quote poetry, you use slash marks to separate the lines. And that's because poetry has meter, and in order to maintain the meter of the poem, you have to separate the lines with slash marks so that the reader knows where the line begins and ends and what the meter is. So in this case, I'm quoting one of my favorite songs of all time, Whitesnake's Here I Go Again. Here I go again on my own, going down the only road I've ever known. Like a drifter, I was born to walk alone. So in this case, I've taken those 3 lines and I've separated them with a slash. And note there's a space both before and after the slash mark. So again, that slash tells the reader how long the line is and where the line begins and ends, so they can get a sense of the meter to it. For block quotations, give the lines as they appear in print. So again, if you're quoting 4 or more lines, then you would set it off as a block quotation by double indenting from the left margin, and then just printing it the way it would appear on a lyric sheet. So 1 line per line. So here I go again on my own, next line, going down the only road I've ever known, so on and so forth. Now note in the citations here, I've given a range of numbers. In MLA, when you quote prose, then you use a page number. When you quote verse, such as poetry, you include line numbers instead. So the numbers I've listed here, 15 through 17, those are the lines in the song where those lines appear. Those are the line numbers. And then citing. So Modern Language Association is used primarily in the humanities, so English, music, arts, literature, philosophy. These are the subject areas or disciplines that focus on studying the creative outputs of the human race. So that's why they call it humanities. And in the humanities, we believe that a person who comes up with an original idea is the owner of that idea. So MLA citations emphasize the ownership of ideas by identifying who the author is or who the creator is and where that information came from. So in this case, Lunsford 107. When I use that idea from Lunsford's book, I need to give credit to her as the owner and I need to indicate the place in her work where that idea came from. So in that case, the page number. Again, if it's poetry, then you would use line numbers instead. But you need to give the owner and the location in your citation. And then MLA has a separate page at the end of the paper called the works cited. And on the works cited page, you list all of the works that you cite within your writing. And you do it in a certain way. You double space it. So the entire manuscript should be double spaced. That includes the heading, the essay itself, and then finally the works cited. The entire thing's double spaced. And the entries on the works cited page are listed alphabetically, and you use hanging indentation. Hanging indentation is when you indent the second and subsequent lines instead of the first. When you indent the first line, that's called a paragraph indentation. Because a works cited page is going to list all of the works cited using double space, it is the hanging indentation that separates them. So use hanging indentation, list your sources alphabetically, and then there's a certain pattern to MLA format. And definitely use your handbooks for help to give you a guide for this. But the basic pattern is that the author's name comes first, or the owner, and then the title follows that. If it's the title of a book, it's italicized, and that applies to movies and video games. If it's a complete work, in other words, then the title is italicized. If it's part of a larger work, so for example, if it's a song title, or if it's a short story that's part of a larger work, then you put that within quotation marks. So in this case, author, title, and then publication information, such as what edition does that is that book or that source, who published it, and the date of publication. That's the basic format for MLA: author, title or location, and publisher and publication information. There are some variations depending on the type of source. So if it's a website, for example, it's going to be a little bit different. But that's the basic pattern, and you can look this up very easily in your handbook, and it'll show you how to cite different types of sources using MLA format. And then there are some conventions when it comes to writing about literature. So, for example, don't summarize, analyze. So if you're analyzing or writing about a movie, don't summarize the movie. Assume that your reader is already familiar with the text that you're analyzing. So they don't need to be told what happens. They need to be told why it happens. Or they need to get an explanation. And so that's your job, is to analyze the text as opposed to summarize it for them. Use either full names or last names only. So if you're referring to an author, refer to them generally the first time by full name, and then subsequently using the last name only. Don't refer to the writer by first name. That's too informal, and that's not appropriate for this sort of writing situation. Use present verb tense when discussing events within the work. So if you want to analyze a movie, for example, and you want to give some examples of things that happened in the movie without summarizing, then describe them using the present verb tense. If you're discussing stuff that happens outside the context of the work, if you're talking about the author's life, for example, then you would use the past verb tense. Don't confuse the writer with the speaker. There is a tendency, especially in poetry, to confuse the poet or the songwriter with the speaker of the poem or the song. So, for example, in that Whitesnake song, Here I Go Again on My Own, even though it's written or told, spoken from the first person using I, that's not necessarily the singer, him or herself. Often, what happens in poems or songs is the writer will create a persona in order, excuse me, in order to tell that song or story or whatever. It's a persona that the author uses in order to speak from that perspective. So don't confuse the persona with the writer, him or herself. They're usually not the same. Italicized titles of whole works, such as books, albums, games, etc., and then quote titles of works that are part of a larger whole. So stories, songs, episodes, put those within quotation marks. All right. And that is the last assignment, which is the literary analysis. So the first draft is going to be due at the end of this week, and the final draft will be due at the end of next week. Now, be sure to check e-learning and the syllabus for specific due dates, and also for the assignment sheet, which is linked on e-learning. Sometimes the due dates will change depending on which semester or term it is. So always make sure that you're submitting it on time. So just double check the syllabus in e-learning to make sure what the due dates are. And the assignment is to analyze work of literature using one of the 9 critical approaches. And I would say, let's broaden this a little bit. You don't have to limit yourself to just one of the approaches. You could mix and match however you want. Or if you want to, you could use all of them. But the idea is to analyze a work of literature using those tools. Do not limit yourself to just stories and poems. Movies, TV shows, video games, comic books, and songs also count as works of literature. So choose a text and analyze it. It's pretty simple. Okay, and that's it for this week. And like I said, this is the last week of instruction. So next week, the final draft is going to be due, and that's going to be the end of the term. So again, we're here in the home stretch. We're almost to the end. Just this last little bit to push through. So good luck with that. Try to have fun with it. And as always, take it easy, take care, and be excellent to each other.